this morning at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, US, the Washington home of the IISS. My name is Sam Karab, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS, and we're very pleased to welcome Frank Rose, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Space and Defense Policy, to speak today about U.S. priorities for outer space diplomacy in President Obama's second term. IISS, for those of you who don't know us well, is a global think tank with a total of 4 fully fledged offices, including our mothership in London, but also in Bahrain, Singapore, and here in Washington. The Bahrain and Singapore offices grew out of the 2 regional dialogues the Institute has pioneered over the past decade: the Manama Dialogue for the Middle East and the Shangri-La Dialogue for the Asia Pacific. The Institute also publishes Survival, Quarterly Journal of International Affairs, the annual Military Balance, the 2013 edition of which was just launched here last week, and the Adelphi book series, some of which are on display in the back. This office, the IISS US, is a critical part of that broader IISS network. We seek both to bring a global perspective to Washington and to convey Washington's perspective to a sometimes skeptical international audience. I should also mention that the IISS is a membership organization, and for those who aren't members, can find information either at the back or on our website, IISS.org. Enough about us, though. We're here today to hear from Frank. In his position as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the ABC Bureau at the State Department, the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau, Frank is responsible for key issues related to missile defense and military space policy. Prior to joining the department in 2009, he held various staff positions in the U.S. House of Representatives, including on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He received his MA in War Studies from King's College, University of London, and a BA in History from American University. Having worked with Frank in the Arms Control Bureau at the State Department for a year prior to joining the Institute, I can tell you one more thing about him. He takes diplomatic engagement very seriously. In a bureau where the leadership does a lot of travel, I think Frank must have the record for most miles flown in his dogged multilateral work on furthering U.S. interests in space and missile defense around the world. I wanted to use the opportunity today of his rare presence in Washington to let Frank give something of an extended trip report on his space-related engagement over the past few years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Frank, who will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. I should also remind everyone that we're on the record. Thank you.
Well, Sam, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's great to be back at IISS. As a student in London in the late 1990s, I spent many, many hours in the library at the IISS's old headquarters on Tavistock Street, so I'm dating myself. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about outer space diplomacy in President Obama's second term. This morning, I'd like to focus on 3 issues. First, I'd like to outline the challenges to the space environment, including the growth of space debris and anti-satellite capabilities. Second, I'll explain how President Obama's 2010 national space policy seeks to respond to these challenges. And third, I'll describe some of the specific diplomatic initiatives that we at the State Department are working on to implement the President's vision. Let me start by discussing the challenges to the space environment. The benefits of space permeate almost every aspect of our daily lives. For example, information derived from space systems helps us warn of natural disasters, facilitate navigation and transportation globally, provides global access to financial operations, and scores of other activities worldwide. However, the space environment has changed in fundamental ways since the beginning of the space age over 50 years ago. Back then, you had 2 powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, operating space systems. Today, over 60 nations and government consortia operate space systems, as well as numerous commercial and academic operators, creating an environment that is increasingly congested. For example, the U.S. Department of Defense currently tracks over 22,000 objects in space larger than 10 centimeters, of which about 1,100 are active satellites. There are also hundreds of thousands of additional objects too small to track, but still are capable of damaging satellites in orbit in the International Space Station. Over the past 5 years, we have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of debris as a result of two events. The first was China's 2007 anti-satellite test against one of its own weather satellites. And the second was the collision between a defunct Russian Cosmos satellite and a commercially operated Iridium satellite. These two events are responsible for 36% of all the trackable debris in low Earth orbit. The threats to the space environment will increase also as more nations and non-state actors develop and deploy counter-space systems. Therefore, it's clear that space is also becoming increasingly contested. Today, space systems and their supporting infrastructure face a range of man-made threats that may degrade, disrupt, or destroy assets. As Director of National Intelligence James Clapper recently testified to Congress, and I quote, "Space systems and their supporting infrastructures enable a wide range of services. Other nations recognize these benefits to the United States and seek to counter the U.S. strategic advantage by pursuing capabilities to deny or destroy our access to space services. Threats to vital U.S. space services will increase during the next decade as disruptive and destructive counter-space capabilities are developed. Irresponsible acts against space systems will have implications beyond the space environment, disrupting worldwide services upon which civil, commercial, and national security sectors depend. In particular, we continue to be concerned about the continuing development of China's multifaceted anti-satellite program. Given the increasing threat through either irresponsible or unintentional acts to the long-term sustainability, stability, safety, and security of space operations, we must work with the community of spacefaring nations to preserve the space environment for all nations in future generations. Noting the challenges to the space environment cannot be solved by one nation alone, President Obama's 2010 National Space Policy places a high priority on expanding international cooperation to maintain the long-term sustainability and security of the space environment. For example, the introduction of the National Space Policy states, and I quote, "Irresponsible acts in space have damaging consequences for all of us. All nations have the right to use and explore space, but with that right comes responsibilities. The United States calls on all nations to work together to adopt approaches for responsible activity in space to preserve this right and benefit for future generations." The National Space Policy directs the U.S. government to pursue a couple of key goals related to international affairs. These goals include expanding international cooperation on mutually beneficial space activities to broaden and extend the benefits of space and further the peaceful use of space, and two, strengthen stability in space through domestic and international measures to promote safe and responsible use of the domain, improved information collection and sharing for space collision avoidance, and strengthening measures to mitigate orbital debris. In pursuit of the National Space Policy's goal, the policy directs departments and agencies of the U.S. government in consultation with the Secretary of State to strengthen U.S. leadership in space-related fora and activities such as the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, identify areas for potential international cooperation, develop and pursue bilateral and multilateral transparency and confidence building measures to encourage responsible actions in and peaceful use of space, and preserve the space environment through the development and adoption of international and industry standards and policies to minimize debris, such as the United Nations Debris Mitigation Guidelines. Now, let me discuss some of the specific diplomatic initiatives that we're working at the State Department to implement the President's guidance. On January 17, 2012, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced that the United States had decided to work with the European Union and other spacefaring nations to develop an international code of conduct. She stated, and I quote, The long-term sustainability of the space environment is at serious risk from space debris and irresponsible actors. Unless the international community addresses these challenges, the space environment around our planet will become increasingly hazardous to human spaceflight and satellite systems, which would create damaging consequences for all of us. An international code of conduct, if adopted, would establish guidelines for responsible behavior to reduce the hazards of debris-generating events and increase the transparency of operations in space to avoid the dangers of collisions. The United States believes that the European Union's latest draft is a useful foundation and constructive starting point for developing a consensus international code of conduct. We look forward to participating in the open-ended consultative meeting that the EU will be convening with our host, the Ukrainian government in Ukraine in this upcoming May. These consultations will provide an opportunity to address all elements of the draft code. Along with our partners in the EU, the United States' aim remains to find agreement on a text that is acceptable to all interested states and thus brings effective security benefits in a relatively short term. I'd also like to discuss the work of the Group of Government Experts, or GGE, on outer space transparency and confidence building measures established by the UN General Assembly. The purpose of this GGE is to examine options for establishing bilateral and multilateral TCBMs that support the long-term sustainability and security of the space environment. Representatives from 14 nations, including the United States, serve on this GGE, and I serve as the U.S. representative to the group. The group held its first meeting in July 2013 at UN headquarters in New York City. The key objective of the GGE is to develop a consensus report that outlines a list of pragmatic space TCBMs that nations can sign up to on a voluntary basis. Legally binding arms control is outside the scope of this GGE. The GGE will hold its next meeting in Geneva next week to consider the first draft of the report with the goal of finalizing the report by July of this year. Another area where we are discussing space sustainability and security is within the Group of 8, or G8, which conducted its annual meeting at Camp David last May. In its role as president of the G8 last year, the United States introduced discussions on the long-term sustainability and security of the space environment within the group. In the G8 Non-Proliferation Director's Statement, the G8 addressed space sustainability and security in great detail. In particular, that statement first noted that outer space activities play a significant role in the social, economic, scientific, and technological developments of states, as well as in maintaining international peace and security. 2, expressed concern about the growth of orbital debris, which presents an increasing threat to space activities. And 3, welcome the current efforts aimed at establishing a strong international consensus on an international code of conduct for outer space activities. We expect space security to remain on the group's agenda this year with the assent of the UK's presidency of the G8. At the multilateral level, we have expanded our engagement within the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space on the development and adoption of international standards to minimize debris. The United States is taking an active role in the working group of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of UN COPIUS on long-term sustainability. This working group on long-term sustainability will be a key forum for the development of international best practice guidelines for space activities. In fact, the United States is serving as the co-chair of the expert group on space debris, space operations, and space situational awareness, demonstrating our commitment to making progress to enhance spaceflight safety and to preserving the use of space for the long term. The goal of UN COPIUS is to finalize a report and guidelines by the end of 2014. Let me also now briefly discuss some of our ongoing bilateral dialogues on space security with key nations. Over the past 3 years, we have established a number of bilateral space security dialogues with key spacefaring nations to discuss space security issues. These include discussions with traditional allies, France, UK, Canada, and Japan, as well as discussions with new partners such as South Africa, Brazil, and India. We also have a very robust discussion with the Russian Federation on space security. We are also trying to engage China on space security. We think it is extremely important that the United States and China begin this discussion for 2 key reasons. First, both the United States and China have an interest in maintaining the long-term sustainability of the space environment, especially limiting the creation of long-lived space debris. Second, it is important that we discuss these issues bilaterally in order to prevent misperceptions and miscalculations. The United States plans to continue to improve our efforts to discuss these issues with China. Let me conclude by saying, as former Secretary of State Clinton said in her January 2012 statement, the long-term sustainability of the security environment is at risk, and unless we take action to reverse these trends, it could have damaging consequences for all of us. The United States, working in conjunction with its friends, allies, and partners, is pursuing a comprehensive approach to responding to the challenges to the space environment. This response includes top-down political elements like efforts to develop an international code of conduct, and bottom-up technical elements like the work of the long-term sustainability working group of UN COPUOS. However, the ultimate objective of all these various efforts is the same: to reverse the troubling trends that are damaging our space environment and preserve the limitless benefits and promise of space for all nations and future generations. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Frank. I guess I'll start out with one before opening it up. You discussed how the various, the copious work is more on a technical level, and the code of conduct is sort of a top-down. Where does the GGE fit in that differentiation, and how much do the GGE and the code of conduct negotiations overlap or mutually reinforce one another?
Well,
you could just...
Yeah, a couple of points on that, Sam. One, I would say the GGE is really focused on the political side of the House. It was established by the UN General Assembly, number one, and we will eventually present our report to the Secretary General, and our guess is that he will likely send that to the UN General Assembly for their approval. Second point, you talk about complementarity. Our view, and again, as I noted in my closing, that we see these all as mutually reinforcing. The work of the GGE will reinforce the work of the Code of Conduct and the work we're doing in COPUOS. How are we going to ensure that that happens? Another good thing is that you have generally the same group of people who are working these issues across the forum. For example, I am the U.S. representative to the GGE, but I'm also the lead U.S. representative for discussions with the EU on the Code of Conduct. My staff is working very closely with the State Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, which has the lead for UN COPUOS, to ensure that everything we do is fully consistent. So kind of a long answer, but we believe that, as I said, different efforts, but we have one objective: maintaining the long-term sustainability and security of the space environment.
Thanks. So I'll ask you just to introduce or to give your name and affiliation before you ask your question.
Desmond Foster.
Okay, sorry, I got a microphone. Can you hear Desmond?
Frank, how feasible is it that we could find ways to clean up some of this junk?
Desmond, that's an excellent question. couple of points. One, the national space policy directs the U.S. government to look at issues associated with active debris removal. That is, removing large pieces of debris in space. But I always like to point out that there are serious political, technical, financial, and legal issues associated with that. For example, one person's debris removal system could be another person's anti-satellite weapon. We have begun a review, which is being led by the National Security Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy to implement the direction we received from the President to examine this active debris removal issue. We're very early in that process, but we have had some limited engagements. But what I would say, there's a lot of issues here, but we're looking at it pretty closely.
And leaving aside the legality, the legal issues, what are some of the promising technologies to do that?
Well, I know the Swiss, for example, have proposed this thing called, it's kind of like a vacuum cleaner. There are a number of other technologies that people are looking at, lasers. I'm not a real expert on the specific technologies. I'm much more focused on the policy, but there are also a number of other companies in the United States are beginning to look at this too. But I think it's important, again, given these kind of political, financial, technical, and legal issues, to really study this issue to make sure we understand the full applications. And the U.S. government has not made a decision or does not have an official position on active debris removal, but we're studying it. Great.
Hi, Bruce McDonald, the U.S. Institute of Peace and adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. First, a comment on the technologies. DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, finally, starting about 2 years ago, has a program. You can go on their website and they discuss some of the technologies that they're looking at there. My question for Frank is, I was in Beijing in late January and gasping for breath and having some discussions with some counterparts. I sense that with the Chinese, it would be too much to say that they are favorably inclined, but I would say they are less unfavorably inclined about code of conduct than when say a few years ago. Have you found that, and can you go into any more detail about what you see in the on the code of conduct vis-a-vis China over the next couple of years?
Let me make a couple of points. Let me go back to my statement, and I said the United States wants to have a dialogue with China for two reasons. One, because we both have an interest in maintaining the long-term sustainability of the space environment. Let me tell you a story, and I think many of you have heard this story, but some of you haven't. Many of you know that our Joint Space Operations Center, which is located at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, provides conjunction notifications to numerous governments and satellite operators around the world, including China. So what that means, if two satellites come close to each other or a piece of debris comes close to a satellite, we will notify the operator so that operator can move to prevent collisions. Well, about 3 years ago when I first took this job, one of these conjunction notifications was brought to us, to me, to sign off into Embassy Beijing. A piece of debris from China's 2007 anti-satellite test was coming close to one of their own operational satellites. Now, my first inclination is, why reward bad behavior? Then I caught myself, and I came to the conclusion that if that piece of debris from the ASAT test hit China's satellite, that could create more debris and endanger our satellite. So I am sincere about this, that the United States wants to have an active dialogue with China on this. Bruce, I have seen over the last 6 or 7 months a much more active approach with China, on China's behalf, on engaging the United States on space security issues. I've had some very good top-level discussions with senior officials. I think China is coming to the view as well that it's important to engage on these issues. The proof will be in the pudding. As I said before, the United States believes it is really vital that we have this dialogue, not just to maintain the long-term sustainability of the space environment, but also to prevent misperceptions and miscalculations. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did not agree on many issues, but there was an active dialogue on these types of issues which helped manage misperceptions and miscalculations. And again, this is an important area where we think we need to have a discussion with China.
Could I add just one point on that? What I found very interesting in my discussions is that the Chinese expressed, it sounded very sincere gratitude for those notifications. There have been several. And it wasn't the usual sort of propaganda. They genuinely seemed grateful that the U.S. gave them those notifications.
So let's take two and let Frank respond to them right next to one another there. Greg and,
Hi, I'm Jennifer McBee. I was just curious on the code of conduct of the EU. How much buy-in is there from countries like Brazil and India and some of the others that you mentioned that you were having bilateral discussions with?
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. I wanted to raise the subject of the Ides of March announcement that the U.S. is going to deploy 14 more ground-based interceptors in Alaska. You had mentioned, Frank, our efforts to engage the Chinese, given the inherent ASAT capabilities of strategic ballistic missile interceptors, and the fact that all of these interceptors are going to be right on the trajectory of any Chinese second strike attack on the United States. Isn't this going to complicate our efforts to constructively engage China?
Well, thanks for both of those questions. Even yours, Greg. Jennifer, let me start with yours, and I'll get to Greg's question. Here's what we hear from people around the world, and I've been to just about every continent, except with the exception of Antarctica, over the past 2 years. Generally, when you look at the code of conduct, it's generally acceptable. I mean, most major nations say it looks pretty good. I mean, there are some additional changes that we would like to see as our colleagues from Russia, but even our colleagues from Russia say this is basically the UN General Assembly resolution in many ways that Russia proposed on TCBM. So I think on the substance, there's a general agreement. The real challenge with the EU's lead process has been a lack of outreach in the need to get the process together. And I think that's a result of a couple of things. I mean, the European External Action Service has just stood up. But the good news is this. They have just appointed a new special representative for non-proliferation and disarmament, Ambassador Belisha, Poland. He is the former director of security policy policy at the Polish MFA, as well as the former head of the NATO WMD Center, has a lot of expertise in multilateral diplomacy. He and I have had consultations, and he has had consultations with numerous key nations around the world. He understands that the challenge here is with the process, and he is determined to get the process right. So I think that's the real key challenge with the code. Greg, with regards to your question, Secretary Hagel said the decision was driven by the increasing threat from North Korea. We have a strategic dialogue that my boss, acting Under Secretary Gadamer, runs with her Chinese counterpart. Missile defense and space is on the agenda. Couple of points about missile defense in China. The Ballistic Missile Defense Review clearly states we do not seek to undermine strategic stability with Russia or China. Our missile defenses are not directed against China, but we are going to continue to engage China on strategic issues. It's not just going to be space, but it is going to be missile defense, nuclear issues, because we want to prevent this possibility of misperceptions and miscalculations. So You know, I know the Chinese have some concerns. We don't think those concerns are warranted, but we'll continue to discuss and engage with them on the issue. And again, not just space, but missile defense, nuclear weapons, and other issues on the bilateral agenda.
Two in the back right there.
Victoria Sampson, Secure World Foundation. Frank, I really appreciate all the travel and outreach your office does, and something that concerns me is how do you envision budgetary concerns and furloughs affecting your office's work?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can we take one more from right behind her?
I'm Steve Garber from OSD. Mine is a little bit longer, so pardon me for a second. The first question was about remediation. I'd like to ask you about mitigation. What do you see as the top one or two opportunities to prevent more orbital debris? So for example, I could see strengthening the UN guidelines either legally, technically, or by trying to get more people to sign up to them, or by strengthening our U.S. government orbital debris mitigation standard practices, or simply by making more of an effort domestically to adhere to those practices, or perhaps something else. So what do you see as your best hopes for increasing mitigation, top one or two?
Well, 2 points. First question about the budget, we'll have to see. Right now, I will continue to do what I've been doing until they say there's no money. So we will have to see. With regards to mitigation, let me start by saying I think the U.S. domestically has one of the best records with regards to debris mitigation. But this is one of the issues at the international level that we're looking at in the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. We actually have a working group on debris mitigation. My Dick Beneke from my staff is leading that. So I don't have any specific, because I'm not really the technical expert here. I know they're looking at that in detail. And when they finalize their report in 2014, there will be a couple of recommendations. At this point, I don't know what list of technologies will be there or standards there, but I can only say we're looking at it pretty actively internationally, and I would say the U.S. has a very good track record here domestically.
Any other questions there in the back? Let me ask Frank about the code particularly. Can you talk a little bit more about what you expect from the May meeting? Is it an open-ended session, and do we expect particular? Are you hoping for a particular outcome? If not in May, then is there a sort of schedule of regular multilateral meetings to get there? And then a sort of broader philosophical question, I guess, could you talk about why there's implicit in your remarks is seemingly an assertion that, or an assumption that space is not amenable to legally binding arms control measures. And can you just give us a little bit of a explanation as to why it's more of an area of international engagement that's consistent with non-legally binding TCBMs and as opposed to treaties?
Two very good questions. Now I see why Rose hired you. Let me talk a little bit about the multilateral process. As I mentioned in responding to Jennifer's question, that has been a real weak point of the EU's process. And I think the European Union, to their credit, understand that. What they are going to do is they have set up a series of open-ended consultations. The first meeting will be in Kiev this May. What I understand, based on my discussions with EU officials, the objective is to discuss the key issues and concepts within the code. I understand that they will probably produce another draft based on those discussions. And then there will be a series of additional open-ended consultations. I don't know exactly how many. I think it will depend on how long it takes to get critical mass with key nations. With regards to your question on legally binding, The President's national space policy does talk about legally binding arms control. The previous administration's policy in 2006 said the United States does not do that. This policy goes back to the long-standing principle with regards to space arms control for the United States. And it says the United States will consider arms control proposals and concepts that are effectively verifiable, equitable, and in the interests of the United States and its allies. The challenge with space arms control is verifiability. I mean, how do you verify these capabilities, which is very, very difficult to do. The other issue has been the issue of how you define a weapon in outer space. That has been an issue that people have been going back and forth for over 40 years. You know, my general view, and there's a wonderful book by James Clay Maltz called Politics of Space Security. And one of the things that he argues in this book is that when there have been major, I'd say, agreements and successes with regards to space security, it has occurred when there was an intersection between security and preserving the space environment. For example, in the late 50s and early 60s, the United States and the Soviet Union tested nuclear weapons in outer space. They did it, and they severely damaged their own satellites. We had the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. The Limited Test Ban Treaty is both an environmental treaty, but also a security treaty. The UN Debris Mitigation Guidelines is another example. And so what we are trying to do in the Obama administration's approach is to really focus on that intersection between security and sustainability.
Okay.
30.
Sorry, right here.
Yeah, I passed around a couple of sheets to give some background on what strike me as two of the...
Can you identify yourself, please?
I'm sorry, Mark Brood of Princeton University. And I passed around these sheets which give some background on what I think are two salient issues that are in tension with the current policy. And one is that we are completing, the SM3 Block 2B has been canceled. Officially, the 2A is still scheduled to be deployed, and as Greg pointed out, 14 more GBIs. These are ready to shoot ASAPs. They are fully capable of engaging satellites as deployed in their current configuration. And I'm sure that if China were to deploy these weapons, we would say that they were ASAPs, and we really wouldn't have a whole lot of doubt about that as far as verifiability. We would know, in fact, if they are capable of engaging satellites. It's not really uncertain at all. Meanwhile, the code of conduct language, at least as proposed by the EU, has evolved in one iteration after another, more and more in the direction of being not only not putting any impediment to the testing and development and use of anti-satellite weapons, but actually being affirmatively permissive of their possession and of their use under the inherent right of self-defense. The UN Charter is referenced, although no one would say, I think, that a non-binding code of conduct would ever supersede the UN Charter, so I don't know why it needs to mention the fact that you have the inherent right of self-defense, specifically in the context of destroying satellites, unless it is setting a precedent and providing an affirmative permission to use ASATs in self-defense, and obviously, therefore, to develop them and to possess them, and they can even be fully tested without having to do any testing against orbital objects to create one with debris. So it seems to me as though we have abandoned any hope of not having a future in which many nations, or other nations will follow the United States example, possess at least anti-satellite weapons, if not other weapons that may be stationed in space.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, as you rightly note, many of these systems are dual capable systems. And that was one of the real reasons why the United States has been so critical of the Russian-Chinese PPWT. because you really can't verify how these these systems. What I would say is the focus really needs to be on actions. And one of the key elements of the code is section 4.2 or 4.3. It basically says nations, to the greatest extent possible, will refrain from actions that create long-lived debris in outer space. So the problem with arms control that we have, and I mentioned, is verification. Maybe in the future, we will be able to get around the issue of verification and solve that problem. But right now, we have not seen any arms control treaties or proposals that meet the criteria that were laid out by President Obama in the National Space Strategy.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, isn't that a little bit like saying we don't need nuclear arms control, let's just have an agreement not to have nuclear war?
Well, what I would say is, with all nuclear arms control agreements, a key element is it verifiable? And I would argue that the START Treaty and previous treaties are effectively verifiable. I would argue very clearly that space arms control with our current technologies is not effectively verifiable.
I disagree with that.
That's okay.
So we had a little bit of a discussion about this before the event started, but I wonder if in a realm that used to be somewhat unto itself, although I suppose missile defense and nuclear weapons certainly impede on space, has cyber and cybersecurity concerns and or cyber TCBMs, how do they play into these issues, given that satellites are used for a lot of these transmissions?
I think there is a big link, Sam. I mean, you don't necessarily have to attack a satellite in space to disable a satellite. Cyber is another way to go after these issues. So there is a definite link. In our discussions with the Department of Defense and other key elements in the U.S. government, we are talking about that. For example, there, in addition to the space GGE, there is a separate information security GGE, and I'm in close contact with my colleague who sits on that as well. So there is a definite link.
And will that come to be reflected in some of these international documents that we're talking about, or are they going to be kept separate?
I think for the time being, they will be kept separate, but as things evolve in the future, that could change.
Thanks. I guess Bruce has another question. We still have time for some more.
Okay.
Yeah, Bruce McDonald again. We saw last year on the subject of code of conduct some voices emerge in the Congress that were opposed, and not just in Congress but outside as well. You know, giving arguments such as, "Oh, this is really a treaty. This short circuits the Senate's role," and so on and so forth. Then, of course, we got into election mode, and sort of all discussions focused on that. But there was an election. And now here we are in the new year. I wanted to ask Frank if you could give your sense of any readings you've taken, what your sense is of the attitudes in the Senate, on the Hill, toward the possibility of a space code of conduct this year, and also how you might respond to those arguments that you have heard.
Great. Good question, Bruce. Let me start by saying we're consulting very, very closely with Congress on the Code of Conduct. I spent a lot of my time briefing the relevant committees. I mean, as you mentioned, there is some concern among some members with regards to the code, but I think, you know, in close coordination, we are kind of allaying many of the concerns that some had. With regards to Senate advice and consent, I think it's really important to note that the Code of Conduct would not create a legally binding obligation on the United States. So it's really not an international agreement. I think it's also important to note that there are a number of these types of political agreements. For example, the Bush administration approved the UN debris mitigation guidelines in 2007. In 2002, the Hague Code of Conduct. the Vienna document, which was concluded in 1999 on military transparency in Europe. So there's a long precedent for this. I mean, one of the challenges, another question we get, especially on the international side of the house, is why didn't the EU do this within the UN? And one of the challenges is that the code deals with security issues, but it also deals with sustainability issues. And there is no one forum within the UN that deals with these issues in a comprehensive manner. For example, the Conference on Disarmament deals with security issues, while UN COPUIS deals with sustainability issues. So this is really, I think the reason you talk to the EU on this as well, but that was one of their thinking, is you need to address this issue in a comprehensive manner, because I think it's very difficult to draw clear distinctions between security and sustainability issues. For example, conducting ASAT tests in space is a security issue, but it's also a sustainability issue as well. But back to the first part of your question, is we're consulting very, very closely with the Congress on this. We are addressing the concerns that have been raised. And I want to just kind of come to this, the final point is that this does not create a legal obligation that would bind the United States. And I think that is really the key point. And that's usually the threshold between the executive branch and Congress on these types of issues.
If I could just follow up on that.
Yeah.
There are a number of legally binding international agreements that the U.S. enters into as executive agreements, i.e. that don't require Senate advice and consent. Is that being ruled out in the case of the code? Is it exclusively going to be politically binding?
It is going to be a politically binding agreement.
Yes, we have time for a follow-up question here. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Wait for the mic.
Really clear answers to Samuel's question about what is special about the space environment that makes arms control not verifiable there, as compared with space, air, as compared with sea, air, or land. What's special about space that arms control doesn't work there?
Well, let me ask you this question. I mean, how can you verify from a technology point of view that what's on the top of a satellite? You just don't know. The technology is not there. You know, all the verification experts that I have spoken to is based with the current technology we have. It would be very difficult to be able to tell the Senate, and were we to negotiate an arms control treaty that was submitted to the advice and consent of the Senate, we would have to say this is effectively verifiable. And what the experts tell me, and I'm not a verification expert, I'm not a technical expert, but what they tell me is that they cannot effectively say that this is effectively verifiable with the current technologies that we have.
So, on that note, I'd like to thank Frank for coming here today to the IISUS and sharing the administration's views on the future of engagement on outer space diplomacy in the second term. And thank you all for coming.